Okay, so welcome to our today webinar about decompression basics. As we already presented for a moment, we are Dominic and Veronica, both from Punkfish Diving and Punkfish Academy, and doing a lot of diving theory and decompression theory throughout the last years. So we started with COVID to do a little bit more of online work and webinars and talking about diving when we could not actually dive. And from this, we developed a little bit more training in all the science around diving. So what we want to do today is get into the real basics of decompression. So what we will not do is explain all these big discussions that are done around decompression. So we will not discuss which gradient factor is the best, or we will not compare different algorithms or things like this. All this is very, very important and very nice as well, but we cannot put everything in one webinar. So what our aim is today to show you or to explain you a plot that is used a lot to explain saturation, desaturation, M values, gradients, gradient factors, and really go through this plot step by step to make sure everyone gets the basics clear. And from this basics and some more webinars, we can always continue to level up, to get into some other discussions, but it's good to know first, like, how everything in general works. So we have a quick look on like saturation of tissues, desaturation, and what exactly is supersaturation and where is the risk. We explain what an M value is, and then come to gradient factors and what that means. We will then have a short look on inert gas gradients and why is it so nice and so smart to change the gas during decompression if we want to do a little bit deeper, a little bit more challenging dives. And finally get as well to the point that all this plot that we are using and that a lot of people are using is actually good to represent one tissue, but all the models calculate with more tissues, and that is a little bit difficult. So there is another possibility about how to show what is happening in all these tissues at once. And we will have a little, just like give you an idea what more there is to think about. So you don't go out of here and think, okay, now we've understood it, everything, and now our diving gets completely different. It will not. But you might have understood some things that do affect us when we are underwater, and you might have understood it on a kind of a better level.
Yeah, I would.
Or you know all this already, which is fine as well.
Like to think of this as a decompression primer, maybe. Yeah, you get basic knowledge about what is happening when your body interacts with gases under elevated pressure, so under higher pressure than ambient pressure at sea level, especially when interacting with inert gases. And building on that, then we can move on and understand advanced topics, as Veronica said, maybe in later webinars. Yeah. So
if you want, you can directly.
Absolutely, yes. Here. So that looks like physics, right? It's like,
oh yeah,
the graphic looks a bit like a lab experiment, maybe a very simple lab experiment. What is shown here, that's actually the basic idea on how inert gases, and by inert gases we mean gases that don't chemically react inside the body. So obviously not oxygen. Oxygen is chemically reactive. We use oxygen as the basis for our entire life processes as animals. Yeah. So inert gases are those gases that we can breathe, that don't intoxicate us, that don't cause a problem for our body, like chlorine would, for example. But they just don't chemically interact, but they are present in our breathing gases. Two of those inert gases are very important in diving. That would, of course, be the nitrogen in the air. Roughly 79% of the air, normal air, is nitrogen. And that would, of course, be in technical diving helium, which is also an inert gas that is compatible like with the human body. But inert does not mean that nothing happens with those gases. It just means that no chemical reactions, or next to no chemical reactions, happen. But still, those inert gases, they have a tendency, if we breathe them under elevated pressures, that they move into liquids like the water in our body, for example, and the water in all our tissues, and liquids that make basically up a large part of a human. So why does that happen? Well, now there comes this piston-like thing in this graphic into play. What is depicted here? There is a darker blue area, that's our liquid. Think of it maybe as water. And then there is a lighter blue area, that's our gas, our inert gas. So think of these yellow bubbles here maybe as nitrogen molecules. Yeah, nitrogen made up of 2 nitrogen atoms gives a nitrogen molecule. Think of those yellow bubbles as nitrogen molecules. And now there is this big menacing black piston. And what does this piston mean? This piston could push onto this piston here. And what would happen then, of course, the gas would be compressed. If you exert force onto a gas, you compress it, the pressure in the gas rises. And then, of course, what happens to these yellow bubbles? Their density would rise. The gas would become more dense. So far, so good. But what would then be the point, and that's already depicted here, is that you would get a higher density of these yellow bubbles in the gas as compared to the liquid. You get a gradient, a difference in pressure of this gas between the gas and the liquid. And now nature strongly dislikes such differences. Nature strives always for equilibrium. Whenever nature finds such differences somewhere, she tries to equalize them. That's a very, very normal process. I mean, I could now say, look, I really like to drink liquids that are full of sugar and black color, like for example, cola or coffee. Yeah. And now what would happen if I push over a cup of coffee on my desk? Well, you can guess it. Nature would strive to reach equilibrium. Equilibrium meaning just move the coffee out of this cup. And when it has moved out of the cup and spread on my desk and spread on the floor and so on, it would never again of its own volition leave this equilibrium. Yeah, that's just what nature does. You can say nature is a bit, maybe she's lazy, or maybe she just likes symmetry somehow, always strives towards equilibrium. So what does this mean concretely here? That nature will find a way to make this distribution of the yellow bubbles equal again. And the easiest way to do that is, of course, that some of these yellow bubbles will move into the darker blue area from the gas into the liquid. And this is the process which we call saturation. So a liquid is taking up an inert gas from a gas which is in contact. Now, careful maybe, however, careful at this point, this does not mean that in this moment where the pressure rises above the liquid, only yellow bubbles move into the liquid. No, that means that there's a process that bubbles move into the liquid and some of them also move out. Yeah. However, the net difference, and this is depicted by the arrows here, if there's a concentration of these bubbles is higher above the liquid than in the liquid, the net movement is into the liquid. So they move per time more bubbles into the liquid than move out until you have reached equilibrium. Yeah? And this is what we call an inert gas pressure gradient. So if there's a higher partial pressure of this inert gas in the gas phase above the liquid than in the liquid itself, stuff moves as a net effect in. And of course, if I would decompress this piston, so pull on the piston, make the density in the gas smaller, then the net effect would be that more bubbles per time move out of the liquid than into the liquid until again an equilibrium is reached. It's a very, very simple idea, but it carries far. It goes far for diving, actually. You already know what all this stuff means. This piston, the rising pressure, is of course the diver. When she goes down, 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 down in the water column, the pressure rises. This gas, this light blue area, that's our breathing gas that floods our lungs through our airways from the regulator, always kept at ambient pressure, so higher pressure at greater depth. And well, this liquid, that's us. Yeah, that's the human body. That's all the liquids in the human body, be it the blood, be it some fatty tissue, be it some nerve tissue in our brain or spinal column. Yeah, that's us, or our muscles. And that's basically, it's a very simple idea, but it's an idea that has been vastly successful, that the saturation and desaturation of inert gases happens along inert gas pressure gradients, and that we can understand this. Now that's one thing. Okay, now we have maybe understood how inert gases move into our tissues and how they move out of our tissues. A very simplified model. However, this does not yet answer the question on how fast this does happen. Yeah, that's something I've not yet talked about. So imagine I put this piston down. How long does it time does it take to reach equilibrium? Well, it depends. Like this is often the answer. It depends. And again, let me try an analogy. Think like you have some nice sparkling water. Yeah, really sparkling, nice stuff that you could enjoy drinking now if you like sparkling water. And now suppose you have the option of either putting the sparkling water into a long tall glass or onto some very flat surface. Well, where will it become shale faster? It will become faster, of course, in the shale glassware, because it has a much larger contact area to the ambient gas. And the larger contact area means, all things being equal, that the gradient can be put into equilibrium faster, because there's a larger area over which this movement in and out happens, so the equilibrium will be reached faster. Now, the sparkling water is not a perfect analogy, this upfront to say, because that's not simply dissolved carbon dioxide somewhere there. That's a more complicated process, but you get the basic idea. The contact surface must play a role here for the question of how fast this equilibrium is reached. And we have to, again, do a bit of mental gymnastics. This contact surface, it's not simply the area, for example, of your lungs. Of course, there's a huge area in the alveoles where you have like a contact between the blood and the ambient gas, but this area stays the same, of course, for one given person. Our lungs, they are different between different persons, but they stay basically the same during a dive. If not, we anyhow incurred an injury or so, then we have anyhow a problem. But there is a different thing that like dominates this contact area, and that's actually the perfusion. So we have different organs, different tissues in the body that are differently well connected to our bloodstream. Yeah? You know that if you have some stuff in your body, like for example your small toes or so, yeah, they are not tremendously well connected to the bloodstream. If they get numb a bit, okay, at night maybe, so it's not a problem. But you have other stuff that is very, very well connected to the bloodstream. For example, your brain tissue and your spinal column tissue and your heart muscle. All this stuff is very well connected to the bloodstream. And this makes a difference. It's very easy to imagine that stuff that is well connected to the bloodstream, that this reaches equilibrium faster because there is more blood coming by that can help equalize this pressure difference by moving in or moving out inert gases towards the lung or from the lung. Yeah, so that's the other basic tenet in all these models. Actually, first is that nature strives for equilibrium and will equalize pressure differences of inert gases along their gradients. And the other thing is that the perfusion of tissues is the main factor that governs the speed by which this happens. And now we have already in place what people like Workman and Buhlmann and many, many others had, basically in a very simplified way, because we can now say, okay, we will never be able to represent completely the human body. Of course, I'm made up, if we have physicians here, they may be able to tell this to a higher level of precision than I am, but we are made of an untold number of different tissues. And every part of the human body is differently well perfused, and this changes with temperature and with exertion and with a lot of other factors. So that would be hopeless to perfectly model the human body. But the lucky thing is, in modeling, you never need to be perfect. You just need to be good enough. Compare it to the camera view that you see from me. So there is a camera in my laptop display here, And that makes a video stream, of course, of like I'm sitting here and gesturing with my hands. And this video stream, of course, it's not perfect. It has a finite resolution, but the resolution is good enough that you can see me and you can discern that maybe I have a bit dark rings on my eyes and like that I use my hands a lot and so on. So it's sufficiently well resolved that you can gain a lot of information. And the same we can do with these decompression models. And it turns out, as one example that we will use today, because that's the most widely used model in technical diving nowadays, in the Bühlmann, in the most prominent case of these Bühlmann models, turns out that if you use 16 of such model tissues, or we often call them compartments, and if you give them half times between 4 or 5 to a bit more than 10.5 hours, 635 minutes, you can do reasonably well in representing the human body. Now, what's a half time? Well, easy. Half time is if you think about there being a pressure difference between the gas and the liquid, whatever this pressure difference be, the time it takes to halve this pressure difference, that's the half time of this tissue. And that's modeled to be between 4 or 5 and 635 minutes spread along these 16 different numbers. Now, why it's called half time? Well, because this process of coming into equilibrium, that does not happen linearly. That does not happen like this. No, it happens actually in a way that this remaining pressure difference, whatever it is halved in always the same time. So you go from, I have a pressure difference equal to 1. And you let 1 half time pass. Say you let 5 minutes pass. You have a pressure difference of 0.5. Then you let another half time pass, another 5 minutes, you have 0.25, because 0.25 is 1/2 of 0.5. And so on and so forth. And that's depicted with these curves here. You can see, so the colorful plot to the right on the x-axis, there goes time in minutes. And the colors, those are the tissues. So the blue color is a 4-minute half-time tissue. The orange color is 8-minute. The gray one is 27 minutes. The yellow one is 54.3 minutes. Now, these numbers are because those are the numbers taken from one of these Bühlmann models. And then the green one would be 305 minutes, already longer than 5 hours. That's already very long. So now what happens to the y-axis, you see in percent the saturation. So you see how close in percent this tissue is to equilibrization. 100% would mean this tissue is in equilibrium. Now let's look at the fastest tissue, this 4-minute one. Okay, you let 4 minutes pass, check where this blue line is at 50%. Vero puts the arrow here at 50%, exactly as we predicted. Let another 4 minutes pass, put the arrow to 8 minutes. Well, we are at 75%. We again halved the remaining pressure difference. Now, do the same exercise with the orange line. Prediction is it should take 8 minutes to come to 50%. And you see, after 8 minutes, this line is at 50%. Yeah, that's the idea behind this. Okay, of course, that means mathematically, we never reach perfect equilibrium. That's fine. That's okay. We can normally think of like if we let 6 half times pass, that's as good. That's close enough for government work, as we sometimes like to say. That's enough to think of it as being in equilibrium. Maybe some of you have heard about half times in a different context when we talk about radioactivity, for example, reactor accidents. Then some radioactive isotopes, unfortunately, sometimes get released. And they have half times, meaning in 1 half time, they go from the full activity to half of the activity and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's the same concept here. The process is, of course, a different one, but it's the same concept. It's often found in nature that you have these processes that happen along to half times. And the same is actually for desaturation then again. And for this, we can use this small graphic to the lower left. Again, to the right goes time, and these subsections here, those are 1 and 2 and so on half times. And then to the y-axis again goes pressure. Yeah, and then the green thing is like there's the ambient pressure, and this downward going slope, that's the desaturation of one of these tissues. Yeah, after 1 half time, you have a 50% pressure difference remaining, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's not too complicated, right? That's quite okay, and that's actually more or less what we need. That's the basic idea between models. So you can remember that immediately. What do I need to know? Well, there's inert gases in our breathing gases. They don't do biochemistry, they don't bind to other molecules, but they are there. Nature loves equilibrium, so nature likes to move these inert gases into my body if I breathe them under elevated pressure, and likes to remove them again when the pressure drops. And this moving in and out, it happens along to half times, and those half times, they are governed by how well the respective tissue is connected to the bloodstream. And that's basically all. That's all. It's not so complicated, right? Now, as always, and we will see that, there's a bit of a devil in the details, but it's not too complicated, right? So a bit more complicated now, you see this plot from which we have drawn a lot of inspiration. But maybe, Veronica, you might want to continue here for a moment.
Yeah, I was like, because it does sound so very easy, but it's like all this decompression thing is one of the subjects where you start learning and you think, okay, this is really easy. I understood this perfectly well. And the more you study and the more you learn, the more you understand that you still didn't understand it perfectly well. And as we know, like there are a lot of scientists studying about decompression who all agree that they did never fully understand it, but we have some models that help. So we will stay with this model, and we find like very, very useful this plot that we just want to show you as a big one, because this is what we found as one of the best presentations. But honestly, there's a little bit too much in only one picture. We just wanted to introduce this to make sure you understand we do not make up what we are going to explain now, or we did not develop the plot that we will be using now. We just adapted this from other authors and from other thinkers, and the original of this is actually from Ross Hemingway. He's the one who did program Multideco, or one of the programmers of the planning program Multideco, and with some adaptations that came out of a discussion with Simon Mitchell and with David Doulet. So some of the people who do a lot of decompression theory and decompression science did contribute here. So we only present what's already known about this. Yeah, we don't make this up. That's important, and important as well to mention that there are other people who did actually develop this plot. We just did try to make it a little bit easier to understand. So what is generally this plot that we've seen on that we've seen a couple of times when we read up or hear about decompression? We have here like an area where the pressure moves through this area. And we have a bit of a strange plot because there is no time. Normally, we always have like, or a lot of times we have like one axis that is time, and then we have an axis where is something else. And this is not what we have here. We have two pressures compared. We have here the ambient pressure. Means we have a high ambient pressure getting higher and higher, starting in a vacuum, starting at 0, which is not relevant for us for diving, but which can be relevant somewhere below sea level surface pressure. So this is why the math behind do start at 0. And it does make sense to show it starting at 0. And then at the other axis, we have the inert gas pressure in the tissue pressure in a certain moment. So, and then we have different fields. We have this light blue field. This is the field if something is inside this field, it will saturate. And if something is in this yellow field, it will desaturate. And we have two lines. We have one line, the yellow one, which is the point where the inert gas pressure in the tissue is the same like the ambient pressure. And we have one line, the gray line. This is where the inert gas pressure in the tissue is exactly the same as the inert gas that we are breathing in this moment, only the inert gas. So what does this mean? Let's go one plot further. When we breathe underwater, what happens is that we get into a higher ambient pressure. And when we put our body into a higher ambient pressure, we do breathe a gas with a higher inert gas as well, with still some oxygen or some other gases that are not inert gases. There's like a little bit of water damp, for example, always. So we have a time during the dive when we are at depth where the body is, or the tissues are on gassing. When the pressure of the inert gas that we are breathing is higher than the pressure of this gas in our tissue, the tissue takes up gas, takes up inert gas, it is on gassing. Once the pressure in the tissue is higher than the pressure, than the inert gas, than the pressure of the gas, inert gas we are breathing, which only happens when we go up a little bit or when we change gas, but we come to this later, then we are in a moment of saturation. It's like we are still, our tissue pressure is now higher or the same like the inert gas pressure that we are breathing. So we cannot saturate more, but it's still lower than the ambient pressure. So it cannot form bubbles. It cannot really, it is not too high. It is only saturated. And then we come into the area of supersaturation, which is the yellow one, and which is the area where all decompression takes place. This is when the pressure we have in the tissues is higher than the ambient pressure. So the inert gas pressure in our blood, in our muscles, in wherever in the body is now over the ambient pressure. And this is the moment where we reach a certain supersaturation, a certain oversaturation of tissues. And this is a moment where risk starts, let's say. When we have a look on this and we imagine a dive, so we imagine someone dropping down, getting to a higher ambient pressure wherever, like we go to any depth that we choose, and now we stay there for a while, and we start to saturate, and some moment we start already, we do a nice profile, so we reach our deepest point in the beginning, and then go slightly already a tiny little bit up, a little bit, but we are still saturating. And then in some moment we decide, okay, from here we start our ascent. So we go back into an area with a lower ambient pressure. We go up. To get back to what we've seen before, this line does not mean this does represent the saturation level of this tissue. It does not directly represent time. That's important. It's not like, okay, from here to here is half. No, from here to here is half the saturation. From here to here might be 1/2 time, but then there is another half time, another half time until we reach this point. It starts fast and gets slower and slower, just as we remember from the saturation curves. The first saturation, as there is a big difference between the ambient pressure and the tissue pressure. This tissue saturates faster in the beginning and then slower and slower and slower. So there's no linear time in this. It's just the saturation getting higher and higher and higher until we decide to ascend, get into a lower ambient pressure, And we move through this area of saturation. So in this moment, while we cross this green area, we do not absorb any nitrogen or any inert gas anymore, because the tissue pressure is already higher than the pressure of the gas that we are breathing. So we do actually start to desaturate, but very, very slowly, because the gradient is still so small that there's not really an efficient desaturation happening here. There is desaturation happening, but not really efficient, not fast enough. Like an idea to think about, we could for sure stay in this area and try to get out of the water by only staying in this area and always waiting until a tissue has desaturated long enough that we do never cross this line, but this would take ages. We would never get out of the water. So this is not practical. We have to get into the area of supersaturation in order to desaturate. And now the only really important question is, how far can we actually go there? So what is an acceptable ascent and an acceptable place to stop? And this is where risk comes in, because oversaturation means that our tissues, or this tissue we are talking about here, has a high load of nitrogen, and in some moment this nitrogen might start to form bubbles in our body, and a too high oversaturation might lead to symptoms of decompression sickness. The problem is, there is not the one specific point where you can say, okay, if this tissue reaches exactly this oversaturation or this supersaturation, there will be bubbles. Or if this tissue reaches a certain supersaturation, you will get DCS, you will get bent. This is not the case. It's just the risk is getting higher and higher the higher the supersaturation of a tissue is. And no one knows exactly when we will reach this point where it is too much. And it is basically impossible to know, because bodies react really, really different on supersaturation. So we cannot predict a specific outcome for one specific person. You can only measure kind of a statistical risk. So this means you have to put a limit somewhere, and you put this limit somewhere in the area of a higher risk, wherever you think it is adequate. And this is exactly what the people did who developed the models. So when Buhlmann developed his decompression algorithm, this was done by a lot of experiments in hyperbaric chambers and as well in the water. And this did lead to some knowledge about a statistical risk of getting symptoms, actually getting DCS, not about measuring bubbles, about getting bent. And this statistical risk was then formed into a line and into a limit that we now know as the M line, the M value. The M value is the maximum tolerated supersaturation of a tissue that a model allows. It's not like a fixed line, like from here on you get bent. It is the line where this model sets the limit, and this limit is set into an area of a lot of unknown details. So we have very clear and very exact numbers about M values, like with numbers behind the comma, so with very, very, very exact. Okay, you can now ascend to 18.25 meters, but it is not as exact as the numbers. And that is a little bit important to keep in mind, because it looks more exact than it actually is. It has to spit out some numbers, and the numbers are really justified, but they are a model. And this is as well why there are like always ideas about how to modify this model or make this model probably a little bit more, a little bit safer. But let's first see, when we have, as we have seen before, we have we don't only talk about one tissue or one compartment, we talk about 16, which represent somehow or model in a quite reliable way the human body. And these different tissues or these different compartments have different M values as well. This is like one of the things that are built into the Buhlmann algorithm and as well in the models before him. And it's the fact that is quite well shown that faster saturating tissues can tolerate a higher supersaturation than slower saturating tissues. So our blood is really able to hold some more nitrogen because it does get released through the lungs. And the risk of having a little bit of a higher supersaturation in a faster tissue is just not as big as this, as having a higher supersaturation in the slower tissues. So every tissue has a specific M value, and these lines you see have a small inclination. The distance, like from this point to the equilibrium line, is not the same like here at the surface. And this, it means that the models assume as well that all these tissues can hold a slightly higher supersaturation at a higher general pressure than at a lower ambient pressure. Dominic, you look like you want to get in.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Veronica. And as you correctly, of course, said, that's one of the ideas that have for long existed in the models, but about which we can talk, and we will talk later on. Yeah, this idea that tissues under higher ambient pressure at depth can tolerate even more supersaturation than you would normally guess. Yeah, of course, you would normally guess at least that these M value lines, they are parallel to the ambient pressure line. That's clear. The distance is what drives the supersaturation. But this is in addition built into the models. And there has been, of course, these models have been successful. So we don't want to be too critical here. Okay, now we have this 16, or here at least a few of those tissues, but let's maybe switch back to one tissue. Just keep in mind that in real ascent, of course, we would like to stop as soon as the first tissue would hit its respective M line. But just not to make this plot too crowded, we switch back to just depicting one line. Yeah, and the tissue whose line at one specific moment in time is governing this process. This we call the leading tissue normally. So that's what happens. We have two dives here in a way. A dark blue dive, that would be a decompression dive, a dive where there is a mandatory decompression stops in the profile. And then in lighter blue, we have an NDL dive. Now, what's the difference between those two dives with respect to this plot and to this thinking that we have now gotten used to? Well, you can immediately guess it. What's the definition then? A good definition of a no-deco dive. It's a dive where the saturation, the amount of inert gases that have had time to move into the tissues, is small enough that at any given point in time, you can surface and reach the surface without a stop. That's the lighter blue arrow here. Now, of course, even in an NDL dive, you know that we normally prescribe a safety stop, that's clear, for additional padding and safety margin and other, like having to do with dive management issues. But from the model perspective, this model would in a way be okay with the diver to which this light blue arrow belongs to directly surface with a limited speed, of course. We don't get like a missile, of course, to the surface with a limited speed, and a bit of desaturation happens on the ascent. This is why this arrow is skewed a little bit, moving a little bit downwards during surfacing. But that would be a no decompression dive. You reach the surface, this dashed blue line, at a point that's still below this M value line. And if that's the case for each and every tissue, then our model is okay with surfacing without stops. But I mean, now we are already inside this discussion. If we spend longer, more time at a given depth, well, what happens? Gases have time to saturate tissues to a point, and now that's the starting point of this darker blue line, where ascending directly would violate this red M line at some point below the surface. So we would move into the area that's forbidden by this M line. And that means latest, when during an ascent, the first tissue reaches this M line, reaches its M line, then we would say, okay, let's stop. And stop means in this plot, we do not move further to the left. We do not decrease pressure further, but we wait. And waiting means, well, the tissue has time to off-gas, so the arrow moves down. And you see, this gives a bit of wiggling room, a bit of headspace here, that we can ascend again a tiny bit. And then again, we would hit this M value line. Okay, we wait another few minutes. We move down, 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 down. And then finally, we could ascend to the surface. And that would be a staged decompression dive in respect to this plot. Now again, we have shown just one tissue, and this tissue assumed to be the leading tissue. We have also, of course, neglected a few other things. Inspired pressure is not the same as pressure in the arteries, and so on and so forth. But it gives a very good idea how this ought to work, and gives a very good idea on the difference between a no-deco dive and a decompression dive. And intuitively, I think you immediately have understood now why staying longer at a given depth means that you can move beyond this no decompression limit, just because the gases have had enough time to saturate tissues to the point where this direct ascent means you would cross this M value line. Okay, so that would be what we have depicted now, would be, of course, the idea of these original M value lines, like they were, for example, in the original Bühlmann model. However, we have in the meantime, in the decades that have passed, we have developed, well, let's say maybe a different sense for risk. We don't really like risks so much nowadays. We want to dive safely, even if this means we have to do a bit of a shorter dive, or if this means we have to do a bit more decompression per dive. We have a desire for an additional margin of safety, and we have a desire also to tune these models a bit. So people have been over the decades playing around with these models, and we will also take a look into some of the effects this had. And one of the most important modifications, maybe in practice the most important modification even that has happened to these Bühlmann models, is the idea of gradient factors. Dating back actually, I think, to Eric Baker and others that have developed those. And the idea is actually quite simple. The idea is that we can divide this space between this ambient pressure equilibrium line and the red M value line. We can divide this space into percentages. So 0% would mean you are at the ambient pressure line, and 100% would mean you are at the M line. And the space in between is just divided in everything between 0 and 100%. Yeah. So first important message, these gradient factors measure in percent the amount of way that I dare to cross into this supersaturation region. They don't measure an absolute pressure. So 50 gradient factor 50% does not mean 50% of the M value or something like this. This would be way, way, way down on this plot. It means cross into the space of supersaturation so far that you crossed 50% of the total allowable space with respect to the original M value, just as an example. And now we often do this exercise. You could do that with one global M value. So you say, for example, dare to go 50% of the way to the M line, always, not more. So you would have globally put a gradient factor of 50%. And that's actually what has been done in some of the first publications about this. But you can also refine this a bit. And again, taking up the thinking that at depth, things are different than at the surface. So maybe you want to modify the model a bit more at depth than at the surface, for example. You can say, okay, I want to do my first decompression stop, for example, when I have crossed 40% of the space that I can allow. And that's what's done here in this plot. So that would be a gradient factor 40 line. Yeah, you go, you surface, go to the direction of surface until you are at this 40% here for your first stop. So first stop happens at 40% of the allowable supersaturation. And then you wait and you go down, 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 down. And then you go, this is a bit roughly sketched, these errors here, but you get again the idea. You wait and ascend a bit more and wait and ascend a bit more and so on. And at the end, you reach the surface at 40% of this M value that would be allowable at the surface. That's the most simple realization of this. You put one global gradient factor, for example, 40%, and then you use that. Now, that has two, I think, quite clear consequences. First consequence is you will probably reach the surface, or you will certainly reach the surface with a lower supersaturation than the model would have originally allowed. And you can have quite some confidence in this, that if you reach the surface with lower supersaturation, you run less of a risk. The second consequence is, however, you take longer to surface. You just take longer to surface because you would reach this new line where you now decided to stop sooner, and that means the entire ascent takes longer. And that's sort of always the trade-off that we juggle, right? We juggle in a way, how much time do I want to invest in decompression versus how much supersaturation do I allow myself to have? And there's a bit of a more complicated consequence, but we will talk about that also later on. Now, okay, now we can do something like that. We could divide the space up into, like, say, a gradient factor 20 line, that's the green one here, a gradient factor 40 line that we already had, that's the yellow one, an orange gradient factor 60 line, and a gradient factor 80 light red line. Again, remember, that's just for one tissue, but you could, of course, do the same exercise with all those tissues. And then you could calculate your ascent using one of these lines instead of the original M value line. And you see again this trade-off I mentioned. Well, if you would adhere to this gradient factor 40 line, you immediately see that you would start stopping deeper and take longer to reach the surface than if you took the gradient factor 80 line. Yeah? So that's one thing. And you can, that can of course be used. And you can also do a different exercise. You can calculate, for example, the maximum gradient factor that in a real ascent it has happened. Now imagine you read out your dive computer after the fact, after the dive. You can compare, for example, what maximum gradient factor you reached. Normally, typically in a typical dive, pressure changes are quite rapid when you approach the surface. Actually, the highest gradient factors that you will reach, they will normally be relatively close to surfacing. Yeah? That's a normal effect. Okay, so far, again, not complicated, I think, right? Now, however, what has in the meantime taken hold is, as I said, people realized that you can go even one step further. You can again assume that at depth is not the same than at the surface. And you can say, okay, I do this thing with the gradient factors, but I choose to have my first stop at a gradient factor that is different from the gradient factor that I want to reach at the surface. Yeah? And from that, there comes this famous pairs with GF low and GF high. The GF low, the first gradient factor, would be the gradient factor that you allow yourself to reach before you do your first stop. And that would be 40 here in this example. And the second factor, say you dive a GF 40-80 profile, would be 80%. That would be what you allow yourself to do while reaching the surface. And here at this point, we just want to take the time and say, if Dennis ever happens to see that, also thank you, because we had a lot of very productive discussions in recent days with one of the experts, Dennis Gichard, who has written an article actually for the Dan Allard Diver Journal, which brought again to memory that sometimes when those plots are presented, something is done that's probably not exactly precise. People often like to draw this new line that comes, for example, from such a 40-80 profile, draw this as a straight line, just connecting 40 and 80 here. And that's not actually what happens. What actually happens is that the new, in parentheses, line from such a 40-80 profile, it will be slightly curved, actually. It will not be a straight line, it will be a parabola. Now, why does this happen, actually? That's not so difficult to understand. This happens because we want to gradually increase our gradient factor from 40 to 80 and do this in a constant, always the same speed type of way. And if we do that, so if we say we want to move from 40 to 80 in a way that we cross over 60, so from 40 to 60 and then from 60 to 80 in a constant way, automatically this line gets curved a tiny little bit. It becomes a parabola, actually, not a straight line. Now, the good news is this does not mean that we all have been somehow doing it wrongly or so. I think it's a high confidence that in the codes and in the computers and so on, this is really mostly done correctly as it was originally intended. It's just an example that those plots that we often discuss, they themselves, they are a tool to do an explanation. And we have to be careful because sometimes we all as the community might have oversimplified things. And this drawing of a straight line between GF low and GF high, that's an example where in the past things have been a bit oversimplified. Actually, it ought to be a parabola. That matters, of course, more for the faster tissues, just because there the difference is larger than for the slower tissues, but the effect is there. So that's why we have drawn here a bit of a curved line to really represent this correctly this time. Yeah? Okay, and then all the rest is very clear. We would now use this darkish blue, greenish line here, this new M line with gradient factors, and just say, let's stop as soon as we would reach this M line, like Vero does with the arrow here. And from that, do this for all the tissues, update the calculations during the dive. We can calculate a new profile for surfacing. All well and fine. Yep. So maybe, and with that, back to Veronica.
Yeah, so the big question with these gradient factors is always, where do we put them? Because we did use now this example like a 40-80 pair, where a lot of more experienced tech divers would rather say that this gradient factor low is very likely too low if with the actual knowledge that we have. But as we've seen, the gradient factor low is what makes us stop at depth. Wherever we set this gradient factor low, this is when the first tissue, which is usually one of the fastest tissues, because one of the fastest tissues is first saturated, and when one of these fast tissues hits the gradient factor low, then we have to stop. The idea behind this is that the sooner we stop, the more efficiently we can limit bubble growth, because bubble growth needs a big supersaturation. The higher the supersaturation, the more likely it is that bubbles start to form. But in the same moment, we have to consider that we have more than only one tissue. So if we stop very deep, and to allow the faster tissues to desaturate already and to limit the bubble growth in these faster tissues, like for example in the blood, which sounds incredibly like, okay, this makes a lot of sense, then it means in the same time that slower tissues, like medium and slow tissues, are still saturating, and we will have to do more stops somewhere later at a shallower depth to desaturate these tissues in the same way as well. And there is a lot of discussions about how deep is a good first stop, which we cannot explain now in this webinar. But it's like important to keep in mind that this gradient factor low is highly discussed. While the gradient factor high, there's exactly one thing clear: the lower it is, the lower the risk. This is statistically clear. Does it mean that we never get bent when we only go to a gradient of 40? No. But it does mean that the risk is way lower than when we come up with a gradient of 80. So one view to this, we said that the bubble growth is limited by keeping the oversaturation as small as possible. If we would just stay along this yellow line, we would not have any chance of bubbles to grow, because it needs a supersaturation over the ambient pressure, and bubbles can only form when the tissue pressure is way higher than the ambient pressure. So this is when bubbles form, and the ambient pressure kind of keeps these bubbles together. And in the same moment, the desaturation goes along the inert gas gradient, which means that already without reaching this area of supersaturation, I can start to desaturate, and there is an important screw I can turn when using decompression gases. Because if you compare this plot, we just switched to a nitrox 50, and we just reduced the inert gas pressure, the nitrogen pressure, by half. And that means that in the moment when I breathe this gas, I am in the area of supersaturation, or I am already only somewhere in this area of tissue is saturated, tissue is over this inert gas equilibrium line. We have a way faster desaturation. So the pressure difference between the inert gas in our tissue and the inert gas in our lungs is so much bigger that desaturation happens a lot faster. And in the same moment, as we do not ascend towards the M line, or as we stay at the same place compared with the other plot, the bubble growth is limited in the same way, because I do not have a higher oversaturation. So the ambient pressure, the same ambient pressure, keeps the bubbles together, while desaturation can happen in a very fast and very efficient way. This is why we use decompression gases for some more serious dives, which would be a little bit the same when we use pure oxygen. So there is like something like close to nothing left from nitrogen, and we have a really fast and efficient desaturation while we have a limited bubble growth. This is exactly the way we can go when we want to do something about bubble growth, because if we change our gas during the ascent, so let's say we reached with one tissue, we reached this point of saturation, and we start our ascent, and in some moment on the ascent, we can change, for example, to a nitrox 50, and stay at this depth for a while, so we don't have a high oversaturation. We did not come even close to the M line, but we change the inert gas gradient because we change our breathing gas, and we can now desaturate quite efficiently until we can even get our inert gas pressure in the fastest tissue. We can even get this a little bit lower than this tissue equals ambient pressure line, because the pressure, the inert gas pressure in our breathing gas is so low that we can actually cross this line again without without lowering the ambient pressure itself. So then we ascend a little bit more, desaturate, you know this line already, and then we can do the same thing when we change again at 6 meters to oxygen, and we can desaturate really efficiently. And that makes it possible to get out of the water with a way lower supersaturation. This is the main point for decompression gases. It makes our desaturation way more efficient, way faster, and we can choose a gas that allows us to stop a little bit deeper, but we will not on-gas the slower tissues anymore as well, which is a very beautiful side effect, because with the lower inert gas pressure now, even if we have other tissues that have not been saturated up to this point, but only until up to this or this or this, they will not saturate more once the inert gas pressure in our breathing gas is lower, or even if there is only oxygen, there's nothing that can saturate anymore. So this is one of the things we want to have when we want to have hard decompression. Now, we have seen this plot now, and we are talking around one tissue, but only mention as well that it is always more than only one tissue. We have 16 in the model and an infinite number of tissues in our body. So this plot is really kind of limited, and this is why there are other forms to present tissue saturation. And here we have one very, very nice example. This is taken from the subsurface planning, decompression planning program. Subsurface is a free program, and it's absolutely worth to download it, because you can play with your diving plans. You can plan some dives and like observe with these heat maps how your decompression is going. So what you can observe here during a dive is that you have this 16 tissues. You have 16 lines here, one under the other. And these lines, each of these lines represent one tissue, from the very fastest to the very slowest. And now when you descend, you have this bluish up to black lines that show the level of on-gassing for this particular tissue. So here we can see that the very first tissues at this point already reached equilibrium. They are fully saturated. And the little bit slower ones reach like their 80%, their 60%, and the slow ones, they did not even really start to saturate in our normal recreational dives. Even if it's a longer technical dive, they are not really effective from 90 minutes or something. You remember this, they said a half time of more than 10 hours, so it is not bothered at all. And now at this point, we can see that here the ascent starts and the color starts to change. And we can there observe what happens with the desaturation. And it shows percentages of the Bullman value. So this is where gradients do come in again, because you here see the same 16 lines when very likely here when reaching the surface. And you see that the very fast tissues, they already desaturated enough on the ascent that they are back to a 0 to 20% oversaturation, supersaturation, which does not matter at all. And then this medium tissues, they reach a little bit more of a supersaturation, like up to 60%, I would estimate, for this medium tissues. So when you see this over a whole dive that you get out of your dive computer, that you get out of your planning, you can observe your tissue saturation for all the 16 tissues throughout the whole dive. And you see like this critical or this probably critical points and can observe this pretty well. So this is a tool that we do use a lot when it comes to deeper questions about decompression theory, where this plot with the one tissue just is not helpful at all anymore, and you need a way to visualize all 16 tissues at once and not only one, because it does get chaotic, and while you try to treat one tissue especially well and desaturate this tissue especially well, you oversaturate other tissues. So you need to have all these tissues in mind when you plan your dive, and not only one. So this is exactly like where the plot is not useful anymore when it comes to really planning a dive, and not only to understanding how saturation, desaturation generally works. So this is the one limit, but there are other limits to all these ideas of, okay, we have certain tissues and we have certain oversaturation. And I give back to Dominic with models don't know bubbles.
Physics talk. Like the bubble. Okay, what's really to understand about a bubble? Yeah, it doesn't sound too complicated. But this has been a bit of the story this evening already. Things look simple superficially, but if we dig in, if we dive in a bit deeper, then we see there is still a lot of complexity. And now we have like of the innate idea, of course, that decompression sickness depends, they have something to do with bubbles. We don't really know the exact mechanism. We don't really know a limit. We don't like, but there is some connection in some way to this process that if supersaturation becomes too high, and if other circumstances are present that entice bubble formation, our tissues make bubbles, and those cause a cascade of problems. However, might come as a surprise, the models we have as of yet discussed, like Bühlmann, for example, they don't really model bubbles. So the thing that is at some point really at a cornerstone of our problem, that's not even directly modeled. All these models do is model tissues and how gas moves in the tissue and out of the tissue, and how much supersaturation we want to allow. And that's it, basically. There is no bubbles in the brain of this model in a way. However, that's not perfectly true, of course, because in a way you can always argue that the test dives that have been made, inside those, there happened, of course, also bubbles in the divers, and in the limits that have been respected ever since, there implicitly is this idea inside that a human will make bubbles. If those become too much, we get a problem, and we set the limits in a way that most humans don't get a problem. But still, that's a bit of a thing that's not maybe perfectly satisfactory at this moment. It's the best we do at the moment. Now, why it's so hard to do this differently? First is these bubbles, you see a sketch to the right, and even that is very much simplified still. It's of course a bit more complex than you have a blob of gas inside a liquid or so. This bubble, typically it has a surface, and this surface, it's not simply air or gas or nitrogen at the one side and water at the other side. No, this surface, it contains normally some molecules also. And these molecules, they orient somehow. And these molecules, they cause that this surface is partly permeable. So molecules of the gas can partly cross through the surface, but probably not in the same rate and in the same amount at every depth and every pressure, for example. You have this process of gas moving into the bubble, moving out of the bubble. You have the surface tension of the bubble. You have the ambient pressure acting on the bubble. You have the gas in the bubble counteracting this, of course. And maybe this bubble is even subject to other outside forces still. So it's a complex thing. And that's just one bubble we have been talking about. Of course, typically that was just one bubble we have been talking about. Now, of course, we typically would assume that we have a huge amount and diversity of bubbles. And now that's also what we see in measurements. Yeah, if divers are tested for such venous gas emboli, VGEs, after dives, you typically see that there is quite an amount of variability between individuals. So one person after the same dive might have bubbles, the other might have no discernible bubbles. And even for one individual, if you let them do a very similar dive over several days, you might see that there is a different amount of bubbles that this person produces. So it's not only about modeling the bubble, it's also about the question of the person and the circumstances that produce the bubbles. And that maybe explains why it's so hard to really get a firm grasp on these bubbles. And it maybe also in part explains why this idea of, hey, let's also model the bubbles, it has been tried, of course. As of yet, at least in this regime of diving that we do, it does not seem to be more successful than what we have been pursuing now with these classical models that just follow the gas content. And it maybe also explains why there cannot be hard and fast limits, why there cannot be something like, don't cross this line, otherwise you will produce bubbles and these bubbles will hurt you. It, again, to come back to this famous quote, maybe tells you why all this business is drawing a solid line somewhere in a fuzzy area of risk that we don't really understand. Yeah, it's from Baker, I think, this quote, right?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. And this is like, yeah, this is exactly like the other limit, because like generally there are, you all have heard about these bubble models that exist. And like the general physical behavior of bubbles is quite good understood, I think. It's like, it's not such a big miracle, but the big miracle around it is the human body, where there are a lot of things happening that are not 100% understood. So beside that, we have bubbles or no bubbles, or a huge amount of bubbles or less bubbles in our body after a dive, there are more reactions to the dive, and some of them are kind of normal reaction to physical activity. So when we do sports, our body reacts somehow to this. We get some inflammatory responses as well when we're running, and not only when diving, but there are some measurable like differences, some immune reactions, some inflammatory responses. And there are like connections between the endothelium and the bubbles that kind of interact with each other. So there is a very big area of things that might happen in one specific body on one specific day, that together with the nitrogen load lead to this day, this person has DCS and the other day not. But it's still not really deciphered. So there are, when you read like the actual studies about decompression sickness, there is a huge amount of studies around like markers in the blood and immune responses and all these things, like even genetics, like about rats that are specifically designed to be a little bit more resilient to DCS, but no one is able to tell what exactly is the point that makes it happen that one person does get DCS after a specific dive and another person does not. So there are too many unknown factors. There are like some signs, like we know that for certain types of DCS, how the bubbles can move to the body once they appear, if they can move from the venous to the arterial side, for example, through a PFO, a little hole in the heart, or if if the general fitness of a person allows a better or a little bit weaker reaction to bubbles. This does make differences that are measurable somehow, but why it happens to one person in one day is really still not understood and will maybe never be completely deciphered. So far, like for the limits of this knowledge, and so far for why maybe the more important point is like to understand the models and kind of accept that there will always be a small risk diving with us. There can be DCS after diving, yeah, but to accept as well that the risk is low enough that as long as we did not get it and we do not have this personal problem that we ask ourselves, why did it happen to me? The risk of driving to the dive site is maybe a lot higher than the dive itself. And there will be things that we will not know, but we know that we do control the risks quite well because the models we are using do work. We are quite successful. Diving is not a dangerous sport at all. And all this knowledge we try to collect about diving is nice and is important. And it's good to like advance with this and to learn more and more and more. But the more important thing is like, yeah, go diving.